Hello, sisters. Lesbian Psychologies Explorations and Challenges, edited by the Boston Lesbian Psychologies Collective. Part 1 Identity. Essay 4 Aging Lesbians Observations and Speculations by Buffy Dunker. Thinking about aging in general, and aging lesbians in particular, I am aware of an aspect of the theory of relativity. The description of an object under study changes with the position of the viewer, and changes especially if the viewer is in motion. What I write here is affected by my experience of aging and my slight knowledge of other old lesbians. The stereotypes of age that I had when I was 40 bear little resemblance to the way I see myself and other old women now. And what can be said about older lesbians now will change greatly in the coming years. This viewer is in motion. The object is not only changing, but it is also largely invisible. In an article on older women, Mathilde Poor notes that, quote, relatively few women over 65 identify themselves as lesbians, end quote. She goes on to estimate, from 1977 figures, that there were at that time at least 835,000 old lesbians. It's fair to assume that there are a lot more nearly a decade later. Where are they? Today, as younger lesbians are beginning to consolidate their strengths and influence, the presence of older lesbians is sorely needed for role models and mentors, for our source of wisdom and courage, and by their numbers, to make all of us more visible, a force to be reckoned with. Many young lesbians need assistance that they can, need assurance that they can grow into a rich and creative old age, not much affected by prejudice. In older lesbians, obvious pride and pleasure in being who she is, politically active or not, can encourage younger ones to have confidence in their futures. A pair of assured, lively, contented old dykes can give the lie so sorry, can give the lie to much of the homophobic and ageist propaganda that young lesbians are subjected to. Most of the observations here are colored by my own experiences. Born in the first decade of this century, raised in an upper middle class New England family, I married right after college, raised 3 children, and took part in the average suburban life at the time. After I got divorced, I taught in a small college preparatory school. When I retired, I got some training to become a feminist therapist and later came out as a lesbian. I'm aware that some of my speculations are not relevant for the large group of working class minority old lesbians, many of whom may be lonely and struggling to stay alive well under the poverty line. Recent discoveries in health and nutrition are extending the average lifespan, now 77 and climbing. Active political groups such as Older Women's League, OWL, and the Grey Panthers are demanding changes in attitudes and services for old people, but very little is known about the lives and needs of lesbians over 65. Defining quote unquote old as being more than 65 means that all of us are older lesbians. That all of us older lesbians were born before 1922. We've lived through some tremendous economic, scientific, social, and political changes. Some medical and scientific ones can help make our old age more enjoyable. Recent studies and many books provide us with information and good advice. Other changes have greatly enlarged the scope of our activities and influence. But we are still struggling with the same old oppression of ageism, sexism, poverty, and racism, and we are still at the bottom of the economic pile. During their lifetimes, our mothers experienced some important changes in their attitudes and beliefs, and these changes strongly affected our development. Their ideas about themselves were, of course, largely determined by the assumption of the dominant culture, which was white, male, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant. Much of it, much as it is now, although fortunately modified somewhat by the Eastern and Southern European, Jewish, Hispanic, and feminist influences. Our mothers mostly believed that the whole fulfillment of their lives was as a helpmate to their husbands and mother to their children. They understood, with a few lucky exceptions, that sexual desires were natural for a man, and that women were asexual. Their strong emotional attachments to their women friends and their adolescent crushes in school and college were normal, without sexual feelings, and therefore socially acceptable. Loving friendships between women were not threatening to men, as all power and sexuality were invested in men. A woman who had experienced a deep relationship with another woman was better prepared for the devotion her husband expected, and she had no economic power anyway. Quote unquote Boston marriages were not uncommon. For instance, my great aunt Elizabeth, a teacher and a maiden lady, lived with a woman friend for many years untouched by scandal. By the early 1900s, more opportunities were opening up for women to become economically independent. Women's colleges were well established, and some universities provided a few women with professional training. More women found that they could support themselves, so marriages became less necessary. Naturally, male resistance to their independence increased. More disturbing to women's ideas about themselves and threatening to their friendships were the pronouncements of sexologists Kraft Ebing, Freud, Havelock Ellis that women were sexual and that love between women was abnormal and evil. Close relationships between women became suspect, and the term lesbian denoted decadence, inversion, and vice. Those of us who read Radcliffe Hall's The Well of Loneliness in the 30s were convinced that loving a woman meant taking on a man's role and would lead to misery and death. Women's feelings about sex during that period were conflicted, to say the least. My Aunt Lizzie, also a maiden lady, couldn't understand why anyone who would want to read Gone with the Wind, quote unquote, it's disgusting. And so my cousin Ruth in 1981, when she was more than 90, wrote me, quote, hasn't sex gone to the extreme? Certainly, when one is married, only a short time is spent sexually. The rest of you are busy making marriage work. End quote. For those of us who felt quote unquote different, the messages we received from our mothers as we were growing up in the 1920s and 30s were conflicting for us too. Sex was seldom talked of, if at all, and we knew very little about expressing our sexuality except through marriage. In spite of our feelings of being different, lots of us did marry, usually early, to escape the hazards of promiscuity, getting pregnant, becoming an old maid, or most disturbing in those days, wondering if we were a lesbian. Those of us who didn't marry had more resources than our mothers had had to lead independent lives and to understand and take pride in our sexuality, at least to ourselves. Nevertheless, only a few of my 1926 college classmates chose not to get married. And in my narrow experience of close relationships between women at that time, I never heard any of the women referred to as lesbian or homosexual. Besides, many of us didn't understand either the meaning or the derivation of the word lesbian if we had ever even heard it before. Because our strong attraction to women wasn't considered quote unquote normal, it wasn't unusual for some of us to develop bad feelings about ourselves. It seemed clear that we had to keep our true feelings secret. While we were growing up, we were affected by the radicalism of the sexual revolution and the first of the Red Scares during the 1920s. During the Great Depression and the New Deal, we experienced extremes of deprivation and hope. Along with the sacrifices and awful revelations of human cruelty, World War II brought new jobs for women, new opportunities for independence, and a taste of partial freedom from male dominance. It was a time when some women found they could do very well without a man and would recognize their preference for women. At the end of the war, however, there was a great social pressure for women to go back to their traditional roles. Only strongly independent lesbians could withstand such prejudice, and not very many were free to come out. The decade of the 50s was a time when role playing became an important part of lesbian culture, especially in bars that appeared in many of the larger cities. In San Francisco, a lesbian publication, The Ladder, appeared in 1956, and the Daughters of Bilitis was founded about the same time. But the conservative reaction was strong, and the excesses of the McCarthy era, with the with the persecution of homosexuals, frightened many of us into keeping our private lives private. During the late 60s and early 70s, the power of the women's movement, the slowly growing social acceptance of homosexuality, and the appearance of lesbian and gay communities in some of the big cities made it possible for some older lesbians to come out publicly. That was, that was also a time when quite a number of older women left their marriages. We can assume that many of them were lesbians because a high percentage of older lesbians have been married previously. Still, a lot of us who had early on accepted and honored our sexuality knew that coming out to others carried too great a risk, socially and economically. Many older lesbians are now retired, and perhaps some are financially secure enough so that the strong economic reasons for staying hidden aren't so overriding. A recent study shows that it can be psychologically healthy to come out of the closet. The burden of secrecy, deceit, and hypocrisy is heavy. Because we're old, most of us have lost our parents and even other close relatives and friends who we felt we had to protect from knowing who we are. So why not come out? Naturally, the reasons are as diverse as the people involved. It is hard to change at any age, and for old people, it is often harder. Old fears and old habits are persistent. We can hope that some lesbian couples find their lives comfortable and satisfying just as they are, and some single ones can take pride in being survivors. Some, like Elsa in Word is Out, who says, quote, "It never occurred to me that it was anybody's business," end quote, feel they have the right to their privacy. For many whose relatives and close friends have never known of their secret, the risks are too great, especially the risk of exposing their deception to people who love them as they have always known them. Combined with an older person's unusual resistance to change, fear of causing pain to those they love is reason enough to continue in the closet. Because I came out when I was over 65 and my job was not at risk, I've had to deal with fewer problems than perhaps most. I came out to my children, grandchildren, friends, and relatives, and their reactions were as varied as their personalities. The lesbian community that welcomed me has provided me with considerably more support and interest than the small part of the older heterosexual community that can't accept me. It behooves all of us to respect and support any woman's choice to stay where she is. She has had to develop skills to protect her privacy. She has had to deal with feelings of inadequacy and a lot of anger and guilt. She can bear witness to the difficulty of living as one is not, and to value and the value of self-acceptance. Old lesbians, out or closeted, have had to develop certain skills and character traits in order to survive, as do other oppressed minorities. First, we've had to support ourselves. In a system where women's earning power is always under pressure and more than a third lower than man's for similar work, and where high salary positions are for women are rare, persistence, skills, and strength to stand up to discrimination are paramount. For lesbians, prejudice and harassment are common, so we've had to develop a degree of solid, stubborn self confidence and courage. These qualities depend on a clear and pervasive sense of self worth, with pride in being a woman, a feminist, and a lesbian. We have had to be autonomous and in charge of our own lives. These skills are even more necessary for minority women than for white middle class women, who have provided much of the energy in the women's movement. Many minority women, lesbian or not, have always had to support themselves, and they have had to deal with the double oppression of race and sex. A lot of older lesbians find themselves with few remaining relatives and no dependents, so self reliance and ingenuity are required to take care of themselves and deal with loneliness. Some previously married lesbians who had children have lived through the most difficult period of being single working parent. They've needed a great personal strength and constant nurturing power. Not all of us have developed all of these traits in equal measure, but our survival is proof that we have some of them. In general, old women in our culture get little respect. They are often isolated, patronized, ignored. Most of us have been married and spent sorry, most have been married and spent their lives and energies caring for husband and children. As they grew older, they find that they have lost their main occupation and are ill equipped to find a new career. Many realize they've received little emotional return for the long years of nurturing others. They've had little experience dealing with the outside world. Some are even afraid to travel alone or to seek other new experiences. Their circle of friends has grown smaller, and because they grew up in an era when good nutrition and exercise weren't emphasized, their health has begun to deteriorate. Few have had the energy and daring to fight against prejudice. Maggie Kuhn of the Grey Panthers is a striking exception, a feisty old woman who makes a lot of noise, insisting on the rights of the old. The contrast between the situation of the conventionally married old woman and the autonomous old lesbian can be enlightened, allowing, of course, for my prejudices. Can be enlightening, allowing, of course, for my prejudices. The lesbian has had to be self supporting, and the conventional woman has not. The lesbian, especially the lesbian of color, has had to deal with the hazards of oppression, exclusion, and prejudice. The wife has held an honored, although secondary, position in society with many heterosexual privileges. The lesbian has had to seek her own friends, lovers, and communities. The wife took her place in the well established society of couples. The lesbian has been in charge of her own life, making choices of work, recreation, and companionship as she wished. The wife has had to please others in most areas. Even the kind of meals she prepared and the way she brought up the children had to conform to her husband's wishes. Many of the disparities will lessen in the future. Today's wives can get jobs and control their lives more freely. The conventional marriage of the 1930s and 40s was firmly under the husband's control, and at the same time, the lesbian's life was much more restricted by prejudice than it is now. One aspect of aging that's hard for many women is the way the body changes. Skin loses its elasticity and wrinkles, bulges, and flabs appear. Hair goes gray or white, and muscles and joints get stiff. The conventional woman often accepts the male stereotype of beauty and youth, and either mourns or fights the change. She can feel bitter, anxious, and self conscious in the attempt to keep her good looks. Lesbians can reject the male standards. We can appreciate the quality of our own changes as we see what's happening to the faces and figures of the women we love. Our ideas of beauty aren't necessarily subject to male fantasies. It is still common for women to stick with their husbands in spite of incompatibility. How many happy, devoted, older married couples do you know? There are many practical reasons for a woman to stay in an unsatisfactory but protected position. For lesbians, there is less pressure to stay together if the relationship isn't mutually fulfilling. They can separate and often become good friends, and perhaps find new partners. Moreover, they can look for younger partners as well as older. An older straight woman seeking a younger male companion is often faced with prejudice, scorn, and rejection. Exceptions are rare. Age differences aren't so important for a lesbian, and she may be less fearful of aging and its physical changes. A woman I know who came out at 50 said she felt much more attractive and sexy than she had for years, and she is. The older lesbian is often welcome where younger ones gather. It's reassuring for them to know that sexual energy doesn't necessarily diminish with age. Heterosexual women are by definition confined to men for the expression of their sexuality. As they age, they usually face an imbalance of sexual interest. Male sexuality seems to be more fragile and more susceptible to the various infirmities of age. After the irregularities and probable discomforts of menopause, women's sexual energy and enjoyment often increase. This can be especially true for a heterosexual woman, now, at last free from the anxieties and complications of birth control, but compatibility is threatened. It takes skill and mutual devotion to continue a satisfying sexual relationship. No such problem arises for lesbians. We change and develop pretty much according to the same pattern, so our sexuality can be as varied and as satisfying as we want. We've long discovered the fine nuances of lesbian loving, and they don't diminish with age. Mutuality increases with experience. A lesbian couple who can work through their conflicts and differences can look forward to a good old age together. A young straight friend of mine heard me discussing some of these ideas and said, "What a fine way to grow old." Previously married old lesbians have had some special concerns. Most of us married young, as we were expected to, right out of high school, and had our children when we were still in our 20s. We believe strongly that it was the woman's responsibility to make the marriage a good one. Some of us did well, some did not. Some even tried, at that early date, to combine marriage and a career. There was little societal support for leaving marriage. We had to deal with the long established habits of dependency, few marketable and emotionally satisfying skills, diminished income, and a dwindling circle of friends and family. We had had little experience in managing our own lives. We had now to make a living. Some of us faced custody battles, which more often than not were lost. We turned to women for support and emotional nurturing. We had to accept the loss of heterosexual privilege and face up to the usual homophobic prejudice and exclusion. Instead of, or along with, the problems of coming out to parents, we had to come out to children. There seems to be significant differences in the needs of lifelong lesbians and those who experience an identity change later in life, especially in the areas of self confidence and autonomy. Barbara MacDonald writes in Look Me in the Eye, quote, "I never grew old before, never died before. I don't really know how it's done." End quote. Old lesbians have few role models, and it's clear that we'll have to fill that function for younger lesbians. The recent interest in gerontology, fueled by the fast growing numbers of the aged, has resulted in a great number of books and periodicals on how to grow old and like it. Most discuss health and nutrition and exercise in great detail and variety. Most report on research into housing and recreational needs, always emphasizing that the social services ought to be providing for the old. The chances that our special interests will be addressed are slim. Because we've been in charge of our own lives for so long, we can take some of the concerns of aging into our own hands. Such organizations as Grey Panthers or OWL are politically active and effective in taking responsibility for getting better conditions for themselves. In New York, Senior Action in a Gay Environment, SAGE, has a large lesbian membership. In the Boston area, two women gathered some friends together and started an organization that in a few years grew from 25 to more than 150 members and is an active social and support group for lesbians over 40. Another group in Boston is making plans for a nursing home and a shared living project for lesbians and gay men. Quote, "The reason I'm so old is that I haven't died yet," end quote. Read a quotation in a birthday letter from my grandson to me. The possibilities of enjoying the advantages and privileges of age, and at least mitigating its inevitable disadvantages, are greater for women who have been in charge of her own life during most of it. Old lesbians are in a good position for that. We're not likely to have dependents. We're used to making choices, and we've paid our dues. We can choose to take good care of our health, to stay alive and lively. We've survived in spite of discrimination and depression. We can ignore the stereotypes and take risks, climb mountains, start a new career, go on bike trips, take cello lessons, become an actor or painter, learn to ski, write a book, adopt a protege. We can even throw our own Puritan conscience out the window and loaf. We can be peculiar, cranky, and funny, and we can dress as we like. Anyone who has been alive, active, and involved with work and people, always learning and curious and willing to take risks, is likely to continue in that style. If we are going to live the last part of our lives to the full, it's essential to plan ahead. Lesbians younger than 65 must be involved in the necessary planning. The usual strategies for enjoying age with regard to nutrition and health, housing, finances, and satisfying work and family relationships are much the same for all women. However, there are some concerns that are particularly important for lesbians. The first is to find and keep friends, especially younger ones. Isolation and loneliness are dangerous for anyone, but particularly for an old lesbian who may already have lost her partner. The small house in the country is great while one is mobile, but it may be too risky later on. No old person should live out of reach of emergency help. We will have to be creative about new kinds of living arrangements, such as congregate housing, shared living, projects with populations of differing ages and economic levels. In a rural area, a few old lesbians might find a large house where they could live together for support, protection, and good times. In dealing with the medical establishment, we will have to take the responsibility for seeing that they understand our special needs and strengths. We will have to confront some oppressive regulations, even if it means coming out of the closet. The doctor in charge must know our wishes, especially about the primary person to be kept informed and included in the important decisions. Many hospitals allow only close relatives in intensive care units. Lovers may find themselves excluded. In the future, social agencies should have special facilities for lesbians with specially trained personnel. Couples should be able to stay together in nursing homes. Good legal protection is vital so that a lesbian can be sure that her property goes where she wants it to, and not to others who may feel they have a right to it. It's essential to make a will, including instructions for funeral and other plans. A living will can state decisions about extraordinary medical procedures to prolong life. Insurance policies and wills can be specific, drawn up well enough to withstand any protests. We have the right to die as we have lived, with dignity and independence. Finances are always a problem for old people. Fortunately, Social Security hasn't been able to discriminate against lesbians yet, but employers often do. Women over 60 find themselves being pressured to take early retirement at a lower pension. They will be among the first to be laid off too. Because old lesbians aren't likely to have dependents, they can take risks. Even at 65, career changes are possible and challenging. Being self employed has big advantages along with the risks. The inevitability of death means that an old lesbian finds her circle of close friends is shrinking, and she has to deal with a lot of losses. Some of us have younger relatives and friends to keep us in touch with our life and our hopes for the future. It's imperative that older lesbians find younger friends. They need us too. The old crone, the wise women, the which have always been valued in many cultures. We can ensure that they are valued here too. Looking back now from the 1980s, it's evident that society's attempts to suppress homosexuals, especially women, have been unremitting and now and then pretty successful. Our increasing numbers help make us more powerful, but we must be wary of overconfidence. We need to be constantly aware of the deep defensive basis of masculine fear and anger about lesbian independence. Men, naturally, don't want to lose control of those who could provide them with care, comfort, children, and sexual pleasures. Recent conservative and regressive measures are dangerous. All of us, old and young, must work for a world where men can take care of themselves and share the responsibilities of bringing up children. And younger lesbians need all the knowledge and encouragement they can get from us survivors.